From the Weston A. Price Foundation, welcome to the Wise Traditions podcast for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health. And now here is our host and producer, Hilda Labrada Gore.
Hey, Hilda here. Energy, clarity, and an ability to set and accomplish goals. These are markers of good health that come with including organ meats in the diet. Unfortunately, no matter how much we hear that organ meats are good for us, there are often still a few hurdles to including them in the diet, like a lack of familiarity, concern that the family won't eat them, and uncertainty about how to cook them. Today, we address these hurdles and more in an effort to normalize eating organ meats. This is episode 415, and our guest today is an organ meat expert that helps people become kitchen confident when it comes to organ meat preparation, enjoying, therefore, the benefits of energy and empowerment that come with organ meats. Today, our guest empowers us by giving us a framework for cooking them. She offers practical tips for how to identify various cuts and the best approach to cooking them. She also offers solutions for overcoming obstacles to including organ meats in the diet. And she tells her own story of having to practically force herself to eat organ meats in the early days. And she contrasts that to where she is today, essentially craving them. Oh, and her kids? They crave them too. Our guest today is Janine Farzin from Offally Good Cooking. Before we dive into the conversation, I want to let you know that the Weston A. Price Foundation has come out with something new. It is a resource going over the 11 principles of the Wise Traditions diet. We actually hesitate to use the word diet because that often connotes a restrictive way of eating. But the Wise Traditions dietary recommendations are quite the opposite. Eating the Wise Traditions way includes satiating traditional fats like butter and lard, properly prepared grains, raw and cultured dairy, pastured meats, unrefined salt, and even natural sweeteners. These are general principles based on traditional wisdom that can be applied to your preferences and your budget. So check out the new section on our website that outlines the 11 Wise Traditions dietary principles. It's a super clear and easy to navigate page. And we have a booklet that outlines the 11 Wise Traditions dietary principles for sale right now for only $5. That's half off the usual price for the first 11 days of April. Today is your chance to get in just under the deadline. Take advantage of this offer by going to westonaprice.org and click on the 11 Principles page. Order yourself a booklet and one or two to give away. And while you're on the site, you can also become a member of the Weston A. Price Foundation using the code WT11 for 25% off the regular rate of $40 a year. So just go to westonaprice.org, check out the new pages on the 11 principles, and get the booklet. And a shout out to Earth Runners. One aspect of modern life that we don't often think about is how our shoes affect the ways in which we interact with the earth. Our ancestors were virtually always grounded. It's only since the advent of modern insulating soles that we have lost our connection to the earth. Our modern shoes with their rubber soles insulate us from the earth, which is unfortunate because we don't get the benefits of grounding this way. Earth Runners has designed a sandal that allows us to live more like our ancestors, getting the benefit of the earth's electrons to restore our natural electric state. Their Earth Runners copper earthing plug and conductive laces keep you grounded on the earth, even though you're not quite barefoot. Our ancestors lived in constant connection with the earth by going barefoot or wearing leather-soled moccasins or sandals, which kept them grounded. Earth Runners is an ancestral-inspired sandal company which has created minimalist earthing sandals to support a more barefoot experience, both physically and electrically. So, visit earthrunners.com and check out all of their sandals and use the code WISE23 for 10% off at checkout. That's earthrunners.com and the code word WISE23. This is Hilda Labrada Gore, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Janine.
Thanks for having me, Hilda. I'm so excited to be here.
We are so happy to hear from you. I unfortunately missed the conference, so I didn't get to hear your presentation, but this will give people a taste of what you have to offer. Now let's talk about when you were in college and you were given an assignment And you said it opened up your eyes to the world of nutrition. Talk to us about what you were assigned and what happened next.
Many years ago, I studied industrial engineering in undergrad. And there was a time that we had a class project, like an optimization problem, where you write out these mathematical equations and then you kind of iterate through a solution to like kind of try to find a maximum or a minimum, like an optimal. And one of the assignments that we had, one class project, what we did was to go to McDonald's and get the menu and find out a way to meet the RDA for the lowest cost. And I loved this project. I thought it was super cool. All these types of optimization projects, I'm super into them. But it actually wasn't until many years later when I read Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, which a friend had recommended to me. I had no exposure to like the Weston Price Foundation or anything. A friend of mine just said, I think you would like this book. I checked it out at the library. I read it cover to cover and I realized for the first time that nutrition is a thing and that nutrients matter, which is like in the standard American paradigm before that. Like I didn't realize that nutrients mattered and I didn't realize that the RDA, like why they even had it, right? These minimums and everything. And at that point, I realized like wasn't like a school problem. This is like real life. If you only get so many calories in a day, right? Like at some point you're maxed out, you can't eat anymore. You only get so many calories a day. How do you maximize the nutrients that you can consume every day? I don't know. For me, it was eye-opening and I didn't grow up eating this way. And so it was like a big shift for me, but I was all in. I was totally committed.
I see. So that during that assignment, you were just trying to kind of solve for X, right? Like figure out how do we get the RDA with the least amount of money? And then it was years later when the aha hit you like, oh, this isn't just an intellectual puzzle. It's something that we really need to think about. How are we nourishing ourselves?
Right. Because there's like so many projects in school that I really like. But if you're at McDonald's, like the only thing on the menu at McDonald's that has any vitamin C is orange juice. So you have to get the orange juice. I remember that. And then of course you have to get hamburgers. This was confounding to me at the time because I was really emphasized plant foods, but red meat is still the best you can do at McDonald's. But in real life, it's actually organ meats, right? And that's what Weston Price showed us. It's the sacred foods. And that every culture had these sacred foods and they really valued them. And they were kind of the emphasis, and they were given to prospective parents and to lactating and pregnant moms and to growing children. And this is what preserved the good health. And like they really had a language and a culture around this that was so supportive. And so when I kind of dove into this, I was like everybody else, I like got nourishing traditions after that. And I like wore thin the pages of like how to soak and sprout grains and everything because I wanted to preserve the foods that we were eating in our home. But I knew from reading that book that like the common thread through all the cultures is not soaking and sprouting grains, right? Like the common thread through the cultures is actually the preservation of these sacred foods and going like to the ends of the earth as far as those cultures knew it to find them and to preserve them and have access to them and to provide them to the people in the community that needed them most. I was like, this is what we're doing. Like I'm all in. We're doing like organ meats every week. Like we're on board. I had no idea what I didn't know how to do it, but I was in.
You were like, I'm going to do this. You said you read Nutrition and Physical Degeneration from cover to cover. That's, of course, Dr. Price's seminal work. Talk to us about some of the cultures, how they prize these organ meats.
First of all, it comes up in every chapter of the book. Every chapter has these special foods. It was like, you'd have to like go ask the chief if they could like tell Dr. Price what they were or not, because if Dr. Price was friendly with the culture, they believe, then they would share that with him. But like normally they wouldn't tell the wife. This happens in a couple of cases, right? Like there was one culture in, I think it was Sudanese Africa, that they actually regarded the liver as the soul of like the soul of the animal, but also the soul of the person. And it was so sacred that they wouldn't touch it with their hands. And they really revered this food. They only touch it with a stick. And they would basically try to get as much access, like as much liver as they could. And that was really the prized food in their culture. There's so many of these interesting stories. Yeah. The organ meats were prized at all costs.
Right. And you were saying they wouldn't even want to touch it. It just makes me feel of how today we have a disdain for organ meats on the whole.
Right.
I would say in the US, they've kind of were looked down upon like maybe the food of the poorer people because they're the cheaper or the offcuts, mm-hmm. right? But talk to us about why were they considered sacred foods? What elements do they have? What nutritional elements do they have that are nourishing us on such a profound level, even greater than muscle meat?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I think there's like a spectrum. I mean, in general, like plant foods are here and then animal foods are a little bit higher. And then the organ meats are the next, like with respect to nutrients in general. And it could vary depending on a particular cut or particular organ or a particular plant. In general, that's a good way to think about it, that organ meats are the most nutrient dense, followed by muscle meats, followed by plant foods.
We can stop there just for a second to emphasize that. So plant foods have their place. The Weston A. Price Foundation emphasizes that it's a well-rounded diet. We're not against plants at all. But for nutrient density, even higher than that is the muscle meat. Higher than that still is the organ meat. And what we're going to talk about now is exactly what nutrients are we talking about?
Yeah, exactly. So the organ meats tend to actually have the most of the fat soluble, like what these tribes were looking for, these cultures, they were prizing the fat soluble vitamins. And so it actually wasn't always that they would get them in organ meat. Sometimes it was fish roe, for example, or eggs of different animals or insects. Like all arthropods are actually very high in the fat soluble vitamins, arthropods being insects. And in our culture, like we don't really do a lot of insects, but actually it's funny because we do. We actually are familiar with the land, with the sea insects like crab and lobster. And we do prize those foods, and we have traditionally, but also the land insects. So like that class of animals is high in fat soluble vitamins, but the organ meats as well, and also the animal fats. Dr. Bill Schindler talks about how when we transitioned from like being scavengers to actually being the hunter, that we had first access to blood, organ meats, and animal fat, right? And that actually changed our brain. It changed like our species. And we were able to like grow and develop from that, like that as a transitional point, right? That once we had access to those fats and those nutrients. So of course, like liver, for example, has really high levels of all of the B vitamins, very high levels of minerals, but then it's also a storage unit of these fat soluble vitamins. And so it contains all of them. And they really work in concert together, A, D, and K. For example, Sally always says that like A is like the detox organ. It's like breaking things down. And then vitamin D is building things back up. And vitamin K is kind of like the conductor of the symphony. And it's directing A and D where to go. And in some medical literature, these vitamins are so important. They're referred to as hormones. They act like hormones in the body. But the thing is about animal food, like real food itself, as opposed to supplements, individualized supplements, like a vitamin A supplement or something, is that they're in balanced proportions and balanced concentrations, right? Like we evolved eating the whole animal and having them in these kind of ratio concentrations. And so you will find that in there. The other thing about organ meats, just that if you eat a lot of muscle meat, you can end up with high levels of certain amino acids and then that like methionine, but then it's actually the organ meats like the skin and bones and the connective tissue and collagen that balances that. So otherwise you would end up with like high homocysteine levels, which has lots of adverse effects in our culture, heart disease, stroke, like just fatigue and stuff like that. So eating the whole animal balances out the muscle meats. It all goes together. It just like seems like if you just go back in time and you think about how people ate, like it's like the whole thing, like we wouldn't have left parts aside.
No, we wouldn't have. So suddenly you had this aha some years after your college assignment and you're like, okay, I'm going to cook organ meat. What did you start with, Janine?
So I really did start with liver. I didn't know what I was doing at all, but I was like, we're going to eat this. And I was not about to hide it. I was like, this is a value, like this is a value system. And like, we are going to embrace the whole animal and we are going to eat the whole animal. And they're like, we're going to eat, like, I'm going to plate the liver and serve it. And I'm like, you're going to eat it. And I'm going to eat it. And I had no idea how to do this. And so actually, when I got started, I had this cookbook, Marcella Hazan, Essentials of Italian Cooking, and she has this one recipe in there. It's basically liver piccata. She has a fancy name, like sauteed calf's liver with lemon piccata style. Something, it's kind of very grandmotherly. And I like that. And so I was like, this is it. Like, I'm just going to make this liver recipe like every Monday night and like, we're going to eat it. And I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't really know how to cook it. I'm sure that I was like overcooking it. And then I was like alternately undercooking. The thing is, if you cook the same recipe every week for once a week for months on end, you actually come to some relationship with it. You kind of have a sense of like what works for you and your family and how you like it, which kind of happened over time. The other thing is I could not even swallow the liver when I started cooking it. It was so hard for me. I would prepare the meal. My husband, bless his heart, has always eaten everything I've served. So at the time I had like a 2-year-old and an infant. They didn't know any better. Like that was the meal. They just ate it. My husband, bless his heart, he ate everything. Even when I look back, I'm like, oh, that was so poorly done. He ate it. And then I would go to the table last. And I just had this like very methodical, I wouldn't eat anything like all day long. So I'd be starving because otherwise I knew I couldn't stomach it. And then I would just like cut these slices, like very thin slices. And I would just put it in my mouth and I would chew and chew and chew until it was like mush in my mouth, but I couldn't swallow it. Like, I was like so repulsed by it. It was so, I'd look back and it was kind of comedy now. So I would use sparkling water. I would go get a bottle of sparkling water and then I would only on liver nights. And we had this like special, never been one for like a lot of beverages in the house, but I would have it just with the liver and I would like take a swig of that to swallow the liver. I since learned psychology today. It says 15 to 20 times to like acclimate to a new flavor. Like if you're trying kimchi or Vegemite or something for the first time. Right. That over many months, I basically learned first I could actually swallow it on my own. And then I actually started to enjoy it. And then I actually started to crave it. I was like, I knew that I was like feeling better when I would eat this food. It was really like, and then I was like, look forward to Monday nights. And I would look forward to our liver dinners.
Well, one thing I'm looking forward to is learning about your framework for cooking any organ meat, because I think a lot of folks are exactly where you were, that were like, oh my gosh, I want to eat organ meats. I have no idea how to start. And before we even got rolling, you said if we become familiar with the cuts, it'll become easier to know how to prepare them. So talk to us about your framework for cooking any organ meat dish.
If you have something in front of you and you don't really know what to do with it, it'd be really nice if you had like a sort of compass, like that could point you in the right direction, right? And so I have this compass and it's my connective tissue framework. The way it is that organ meats tend to have a lot more connective tissue than muscle meats, which is another reason that they tend to be unfamiliar in our culture. But knowing what to do with those different kinds of cuts, it can really help break it down. First of all, like what is connective tissue? Like let's get an understanding of this. So connective tissue is kind of like scaffolding and it protects and supports the body. And I'm from the Bay Area and we saw the Golden Gate Bridge when I was growing up many times, like class field trips and stuff. And right when you go to the entrance of the bridge, it's like the Golden Gate Bridge is a suspension bridge. So it has these huge cables, the scaffolding, the structure, the support, and the protection that's holding the bridge up. But it has a cross section of one of these cables there. And inside of that huge cable are over 25,000 individual wires. So it's made up of like one cable is like 26,000 individual wires. And that is what gives it the strength and structure. And so I like to think of the connective tissue kind of like those wires inside of that cable, that there's like all these little wires and they're giving it structure. And the glue that's holding all of those wires together is collagen. So the glue that's holding them together is collagen. So suppose you have this cut, it's got a lot of connective tissue in it, and you cook it really gingerly, like you just quickly pan fry it, like just a moment on the stove, or maybe you grill it, but like with an open air, like with your grill open for just a moment, and it's tender and delicious and it's great. So think of like a rare steak and it's just juicy and tender, fine, no problem at all. The problem is that if you hit 140 degrees with connective tissue, it's those fibers, the wires in the cable, they're going to seize up. Let me translate this for you. Seizing up, like the edge of the meat will curl in the pan and it's going to be like dry and tough and chewy. And it's not good, right? It's not what you want. And I think that a lot of times organ meats end up being prepared exactly like this and they get a really bad rap. Think of like a steak that's well done, that's like actually pretty dry and tough. But actually it's like much worse than that because there's like way more connective tissue in the organ meats than there is in that steak. So it's like even worse. So if you get to that point, like really what you need to do is you need to go way beyond that and you need to cook it long enough that those fibers in the connective tissue, they actually start to soften and relax and break down. And that glue that's holding it together, that collagen glue melts into like a rich gelatin, right? And now you have something totally different. Like think of your pot roast. You come home at the end of the day, you open your crock pot, you have meat that's falling apart and it's in this really rich, beautiful broth that's like gelatinous and just really divine, right? So now you're like thinking like, now you've got something wonderful and delicious. But in that middle area, you can get into a lot of trouble.
Yes.
So this is my compass, right? And this is the connective tissue framework. This is like, and once you know this, where all the organs fit in this framework, you're kind of empowered to cook them anyway. Like suppose you want to cook, I don't know, pick an organ.
I will pick an organ, but first I wanted to ask you, so are you saying that there are varying degrees of connective tissue with each organ? So some have more than others?
Okay, so let's do like liver, for example. Like I'm telling you that all of these organs have tons of connective tissue, but the liver is actually a really interesting organ. It has very little connective tissue. It's actually just an agglomeration of cells. And if you cook that for a long time, it'll actually just get disintegrated and become very dry and crumbly, which is very different. But here's the thing, is that liver does have connective tissue in the membrane that surrounds it. And so the membrane, like suppose you have a slice of liver and it has like just like a very shiny edge of silver skin all around the border of this slice. And then you go to put it in the pan and you go to cook it. But the thing is that because that membrane around the perimeter is all silver skin, that is going to curl up in the pan when you go to cook it and it will never lay flat and you can never cook it evenly, right? So with liver, you want to trim all of that off. If there's tubules in there, you want to just cut that out because that's going to actually allow the liver to lay flat in the pan and you can get a nice even cook. Then it's up to you to know, like really, nothing can take the place of a little bit of experience of like how you like it best. Because with liver, I think there's a trade-off between texture and intensity of flavor. If it's cooked more, it has a more intense flavor, but if it's cooked less, because it does not have the same texture as muscle meat, it can be really unfamiliar for some people. It could even seem a little bit gooey, or if you've ever tried to make a blend with like fresh liver and you put it in your blender, you just end up with soup. There's no structure to it at all. And that's like really gross.
Yeah.
So liver is actually a kind of a funny one, but something like kidney or heart, if you have those organs, a lot of people will just try to pan fry them or cook them or just mix them in a blend or something. But I think you can get into trouble that way. I mean, what you want to do is you actually want to cook them basically rare so that they never get into that spot where they like seize up and curl, right? Like Julia Child, she'll cook the whole beef kidney in one piece in the pan, flip it over, cook it in the pan, and then she'll slice it afterwards. Like she won't cut it all into individual lobes because that would be too high of a temperature, right? But if you have the whole big kidney and then you slice it afterwards, then you end up with rare slices in the middle. She'll cover that with sauce, but then you end up with kidney that's really tender and delicious. Otherwise, you have to go completely the other direction, like steak and kidney pie, where you braise that for hours, right? And then it's the filling of your pie. So kind of knowing how they all fit in, then you have an organ meat, you're like, I know which direction to go in. It takes the guesswork out of it. It's like a compass.
This is Hilda Labrada Gore, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. Coming up, is it possible to have too much of a good thing? Janine covers how to get the right balance of organ meats to benefit your body while avoiding vitamin A toxicity. She also offers tips for getting a family of picky eaters on board with organ meats.
You're listening to the Wise Traditions podcast from the Weston A. Price Foundation. We pause now to recognize our sponsors.
Paleo Valley. Paleo Valley has a new offering, wild-caught fish roe supplements. They are gently freeze-dried, unlike competitors who use chemical solvents and high heat. Paleo Valley's fish roe retains all of the nutrients, and it's a natural source of vitamins C, D, E, omega-9s, and the powerful omega-3s, crucial for vision, brain, joint, and cardiovascular health. As you know, Dr. Weston A. Price found many ancient cultures that enjoyed fish roe and its many health benefits as a result. So check out this offering. Go to paleovalley.com and use the code WISE for 15% off at checkout. That's paleovalley.com, their new wild-caught fish roe supplements, and the code word WISE for 15% off at checkout. And a shout out to Optimal Carnivore. Optimal Carnivore has a bone and joint restore supplement featuring a powerful combination of whole bone extract, bone and marrow, and bovine tracheal cartilage. It's the perfect bone support and joint supplement for men, women, and seniors who have stiff joints or inflammation and have a hard time eating nose to tail. They have a convenient freeze-dried capsule to support stem cells, which transform into white blood cells and red blood cells, improving the immunity of the body and promoting cell repair and regeneration. Bovine tracheal cartilage also has powerful effects on the immune system, acting as an immunoregulator, balancing and regulating a health-promoting response to stress. So go to amazon.com/optimalcarnivore and use the code WESTON10 to receive 10% off all products. That's amazon.com/optimalcarnivore and the code WESTON10. This is Hilda Labrada Gore, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. That's helpful. Now I want to ask you, can you have too much of a good thing when it comes to organ meats? I've heard talk about vitamin A toxicity. Is that common when you indulge in too many organ meats? Talk to us about that.
I'm so glad you asked. I think that this is a really important point. And I think that absent a culture that has a familiarity with these cuts and kind of a relationship with them, it's easy to get into trouble. It's interesting because I think that in general, like vitamin A toxicity in general, most Americans are super deficient in vitamin A, right? Mm-hmm. They don't have enough. And it's really important for growing children. And so what you see is that it's actually fortified in breakfast cereals and juices and milk. It's all fortified because like the government has identified that this is a deficiency as a whole, right? And with copper, I mean, you had Morley Robbins on this show. He gives an excellent explanation about how copper is essential for cell energy and metabolism. And, you don't have to look very far in our country to find people that are short on energy and have dysregulated metabolism. So in general, I think we have like a huge copper deficiency, but in communities, it's probably true in the Weston Price community. I know that Judy Cho and like the carnivore meat-based community has spoken up about this, that they're actually starting to see excess. She's seen signs of vitamin A toxicity in her practice, in her nutrition practice, and she sees high copper levels on lab reports. I think that there's two ways that people get into trouble with this, and both have to do with supplementation. So she's reporting that she has people in her practice that are eating upwards of like 6 to 16 ounces of liver a week. And this is like an ounce of liver a day. And I mean, if you think about the whole animal, it's just a lot, right? With respect, like if you have a 1,200 pound cow and it has like 500 pounds of muscle meat on it, it has like a 10 to 15 pound liver. What's the relationship? Like, where's the balance there, right? So in the absence of a culture that's telling us, so I was fortunate enough, I kind of leaned into my own family culture because my grandparents were immigrants from Portugal. My mom grew up at an immigrant home, and she has all of the anecdotes and stories that come with that. Of course, this was like traumatizing for her. She hated it. It's like all these weird foods. She thought it was because her family was like just weird. She was the only non-native speaker in her school. And so it's like not a great experience for her, but she does have the stories of this, which is that my grandma, basically, my late grandma who lived to 101, basically served liver every week of her life. And so when I came to this, I'd heard her talk about liver. I was like, wait, do you eat liver? Like, why don't you still eat it? And, oh, geez, I've eaten enough of that. But she did say like, Bobby served it every week. And this is how she served it. And I was like, okay, this is what we're doing in my home. Like, if this is the way my grandma did it, this is the way I want to do it.
And she served it every week, but not every night. And I think that's part of your point.
Right. Exactly. So to have it every day, and I know it's become really popular to like take liver and cut it up into little capsules and freeze it and like basically take it like a vitamin. So, I mean, that could be a lot if you're just doing that kind of endlessly. I think there's definitely a place for supplements. And if you don't have access to real food for some period of time, and if there's a specific thing that you're correcting, but in general, I think that another reason people get into trouble is that there's other sources in their diet or lifestyle that they're not aware of. So with vitamin A, if you have acne and you've got a retinol A skin cream, you might not realize that that is a vitamin A, a topical vitamin A supplement, right? And it's not just in prescription skin creams, it's now in many skin creams. So if you're using those, you might have a supplemental form of vitamin A, you might have supplement from fortified foods. So you don't realize that you're kind of entering this territory.
And what are the signs of vitamin A toxicity?
I've read, like, I haven't really come across this. So I feel like the things I know are things that I've had a personal experience with, but it could be blurred vision and nausea, dizziness, cerebrospinal pressure, joint pain, things like that. Whereas deficiency is like night blindness, bumps on the back of your arms, which I remember having my whole life pretty much, like those bumps on the back of my arms. Yeah, so that's just what I know from reading about it. It's interesting though, because I do find that whenever I look up these vitamins, like vitamin A is essential for vision and for cell growth and for immunity, right? But this vision thing, you look at deficiency symptoms and an excess symptoms, and you'll both find dysregulated vision, right? It's like the same thing as getting dysregulated, but in a different ways. So it could be night blindness or it could be blurred vision, but so sometimes it can be confusing because you're like, oh, but I mean, there's always like a personal story, right? Like, where are you at in the spectrum?
Exactly. People can look at their diet, they can look at their habits and get an idea if they're having too much vitamin A or too little. And I think your word of warning about the supplements is a good one too. But let's talk now about the hurdles that people face when it comes to organ meats. Some people will say, oh, my kids will never eat it. Maybe they don't have a spouse that is as agreeable as yours, or they think it's just too complicated. What advice do you have to overcome those hurdles?
In my course, I actually have this framework for kind of overcoming all of the hurdles that people have because there's just so many of them. It's my Nourish framework. It's kind of corny, but I'll run through it really quickly, but then I'll kind of address these specifics. So the first thing is just to set an intention to normalize organ meats, right? But after that, like overcoming barriers, understanding the benefits, like why are we doing this, right? Like overcoming the barriers, the cultural barriers, like having a framework for kind of thinking about like, oh my gosh, this is so gross. Like I feel so squeamish. I don't know if I can do it, right? People are always like, my husband, my kids. I often think that like me, it's actually them, right? Like when I used to say things like that, I don't know if my kids will eat it. It was really like, I don't know if I can eat this. Like, I don't know if I can prepare it. So overcoming barriers, understanding the benefits, ready yourself. So that's like scheduling it. Whatever's important to you in your life, you schedule it and you show up for it. And sourcing it. And then it's time, like prepping and cooking. It's like really going into the details of like how to prep and cook each organ. And then serve and survey, right? Like consider it all an experiment and kind of take note, like what can you learn from this experience? Like it's true, your kids might not eat it. Sometimes I serve their favorite foods and they don't eat it, right? Like that does happen in families. Like kids don't eat meals sometimes. And even ones that you have lovingly prepared, have put a lot of care into. And then the H in Nourish is hooray, like really to celebrate like all the baby steps and all the progress. I do think like you saying like, oh my gosh, it's like a lot of work and all this. There's like a perception. You know, when I met my husband, he was from the Midwest and I was from California. We were in college. And there was one time we were hanging out together and then I was going to make guacamole. And he was like, wait, you can do that? Like you can make guacamole? And I was like, wait, what? Like you could buy guacamole? Like I had never seen it bought, right? He had never seen it made. And like coming from different places. And I feel like that is like a big part of the perception with organ meats, right? Like people just haven't seen it. They haven't seen it to believe that it's possible. They had it where it's really good. I remember you had another guest on this podcast that talked about how like go eat it at a restaurant because then go eat organ meats at a restaurant because then they'll, you know, you can like see how somebody else prepares it and you can kind of open your eyes to like the possibility that it could actually taste pretty good. It may not be that hard. I also think that like kind of like as an overview mindset thing, like this idea of experimentation is super important. Like that we would say, oh my gosh, these organs, they're so nutrient dense. They're so important. They're really important for our children. We've got to do this work. And it's like becomes this heavy weight. if you say, oh, I'm experimenting with this, I have no idea how it'll go. People probably won't eat it. I don't even know if I'm going to like it, but I'm going to try it. And it's going to be a small serving, right? Like minimize the expectations and then and just experiment with it. I think that really lightens the whole thing. This is not serious, just nice and fun and easy, right? I don't think life is supposed to be hard. Part of the perspective that organ meats gave me over time, right? I used to be really tired and everything used to be really hard before I introduced these foods into my life. But now it's no, it's not supposed to be that way. It's it's no big deal. We'll just experiment with it. We'll see how it goes. You might be surprised. We're always what if the worst case scenario happens? But what if the best case scenario happens? What if they do like it and you were shocked and you surprise yourself, right? What if it wasn't that hard to cook? What if it came out better than you thought? What if this was your new favorite food? What if your kids started asking for this on their birthdays? Because that's what happens in my house, right? These sacred foods. I'm oh, menudo, it's so much work. And they're please, please, please make it for my birthday. And I'm how could I say no? It's their birthday. I'm okay, fine, we'll make it. I mean, tribe trotters, marrow.
Wow. What a 180 for your family, for you. I am thinking of the listener who's gosh, I've heard so much of how good these organ meats are for my family, but I just am not going to bother. What are they going to miss out on, Janine?
I don't know. I mean, Hilda, I really do believe that everybody's path is different. And I don't know what your path is. And I can only speak from my experience and my path. And my path really called me to this path. Once I kind of stumbled upon it, I was I loved optimization problems and thinking about these kind of algorithms. And I had all these frameworks, right? Of cooking the organ meats and stuff. I really in that kind of analytical mind. And so I feel that was my dad coming in. My mom was just this amazing cook. And she was always having dinner parties and preparing food for everybody. And she loved to cook. And for me, this, all of a sudden, when I learned about nutrient density in food, I was this is my gig. I'm really into this. I love it. And I mean, I didn't love the liver at first, don't get me wrong, but I liked the idea of it. And I have always enjoyed experimenting with the organ meats and just kind of getting to know them and becoming familiar with them. So if somebody's not having them, I don't know. I mean, maybe it's actually not their path, right? Maybe just actually accept and celebrate exactly where you are at this place in your journey. And the more exposure you have, I think, to people like me or something, it might open your mind a little bit over time. But I don't know, maybe it's not for everybody. I confess that my mom, even at this point, is I've had enough. I don't want it. Every time she comes over, she's did you hide anything in here? And there are times I have, but I have to tell her, I'm Mom, it has heart in it, but I don't think it's a big deal. I don't know if you'll taste it. She's okay. But she doesn't want it. I'm okay, I can honor that. That's your path. I'm only speaking to the person that has a little bit of me in them that resonates with what I'm saying, right? That's who I'm talking to. And if they want to learn more, then a website, a blog, Offally Good Cooking. It has nearly 100 recipes on it now. I started it in 2017. My intention then was just if I could have had all this in one place when I got started, right? Because I was scouring old library books and just any old cookbook I could find, I would just flip to the index, see if it had organ meats, and if I would read all of it because I was these grandmas have to have something to share with me, right? And so I would just try to find a way. I mean, if that's you and that you're curious in that, then check out my site, come see. There's so many recipes on there. Something is bound to spark you, an interest or look good to you. So that's who it's for.
Fantastic. But let me ask you now the question I like to pose at the end, Janine. If the listener could just do one thing to improve their health, if they could just do one thing, what would you recommend that they do?
Oh, well, if you want to up level in 2023, I would definitely say to include some organ meats. So I do think that they are so essential and something that's really under-recognized in our culture today is mental health and things like that. And that's the foundation, these fat-soluble vitamins. Chris Masterjohn has a paper at some point talking about arachidonic acid, fat-soluble vitamins, eating liver, and all of these nutrient-dense foods. And he has a quote in there. It's sustained effort and goal-oriented behavior, that these stem from these nutrients. And it's funny because after I read that, I look back on before and after and I think, wow, yeah, I thought I was healthy then. And I look back now, I'm wow, the energy and the ability to focus on things and just have clarity and energy for the things that I love in my life, right? The organ meats are not the end goal. The organ meats are the path to the freedom in your life to do the things that you love. Right. And so there's so many places you can start. If you're just getting started, there's organ blends, super easy. James Berry has the pluck seasoning. I love that because you're putting it on food and you're actually chewing it and eating the food itself, right? I think that not bypassing that mechanism, with the supplementing, actually eating meals and chewing food, that's always been part of my value system. So I really advise that. And you can go to the store and buy a store-bought pate, but if you're already doing all that stuff, go to my site, check it out and find a new recipe, right? Get an organ you've never tried before. There'll be something new there or a recipe that you haven't tried before and just lean in and see what you can do with it. Experiment, have fun. You might surprise yourself.
Absolutely. And I'm so grateful that you've shared your experience today. And these insights and inspiration for us to kind of roll up our sleeves and dive in the way you did, but actually maybe even better equipped because we have more resources now thanks to the research that you've done. So thank you for this conversation. It's been wonderful, Janine.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Hilda. It's been great to be here.
Our guest today was Janine Farzin. Visit her site, awfullygoodcooking.com, for recipes and tips on preparing and cooking delicious meals with organ meats. That's Offally Good Cooking, spelled Offally, Good Cooking. And I'm Hilda Labrador, the host and producer of this podcast for the Weston A. Price Foundation. You can find me at holistichilda.com. And for the transcript for this episode, visit our website, westonaprice.org, and click on the podcast page. And now for a recent review from Apple Podcasts, my favorite podcast. Thank you, Wise Traditions, for pulling together many of my favorite healing subjects and for introducing me to new ways to build health and happiness. I heard about the Weston A. Price Foundation nearly 2 decades ago, but came to appreciate all WAPF is doing about a year ago. You are officially my favorite podcast. I listen to an episode almost daily and look forward to catching up on the hundreds of back episodes. Oh my gosh, Abisaela, thank you so much for this review. It means so much. It's really great to hear from you all. So if you'd like to rate and review the show, simply go to Apple Podcasts, click on ratings and reviews, leave us as many stars as you like, and tell the world why this show is worth listening to. And thank you so much for tuning in. Stay well, my friend, and remember to keep your feet on the ground and your face to the sun.
On behalf of the Weston A. Price Foundation, thanks for listening. We have many free resources to support you on your health journey. Visit westonaprice.org to find podcasts, articles, videos, and more. You can also find a local chapter near you for help in finding sources of great food. We invite you to support the Foundation's mission of education, research, and activism by becoming a member. Thanks again, and take care. Wise Traditions is a project of the Weston A. Price Foundation for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. The content on this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended to substitute for the advice provided by your doctor or other healthcare professional. It is not intended to be, nor does it constitute healthcare or medical advice.